First, I should say welcome to CAS. And I'm very, very proud to sort of see us beginning to host a debate around this question of corporate social responsibility. We at CAS here see our role very much being as part of a kind of the intellectual heart of the city, a place where kind of questions which can't be asked in the boardroom or in other places can be kind of debated and discussed. And I see this forum, and we all see this forum as kind of one of those spaces. So that's what we hope to do tonight, is to begin to debate this vital, pressing issue of corporate social responsibility, what it means partially for business, but also for those other groups who want to try and hold corporations to account. That's the kind of question which we want to get at today. So I should also introduce myself. My name is Andre Spicer. I'm Professor of Organisational Behaviour here at CAS Business School. I'm also part of the kind of emerging CSR group which we have here at CAS. Now, part of this, I suppose the other thing which is worthwhile noting is in the last few years at CAS, we've made a significant investment in the area of corporate social responsibility. That has required becoming more and more involved in various activities around corporate social responsibility, whether that's teaching, involvement in issues in the city, and debates about CSR, but also bringing in new faculty. So today we have 3 of the new faculty who we've recently hired in this area who have been involved. So Jean-Pascal Gond, who is here, who's a professor of corporate social responsibility, who's recently joined us from Montreal. Professor Bobby Banerjee here, who's also a professor of corporate social responsibility, who has joined us from Sydney, University of Western Sydney, and soon to join us, Professor Peter Fleming, who's joining us from the University of London, Queen Mary. This, alongside of the existing faculty, makes us one of the strongest CSR groups, not just in Europe, but in the world. So we have an amazing amount of expertise here in front of us. So I've introduced kind of CAS and what we're doing. I'm going to briefly pass you over to my colleague Grietje Baars, who will introduce the broader project, which is a cross-city university project this is part of.
Okay, thank you very much, Andre. So my name is Grietje Baars. I'm a lecturer at City Law School, and together with Andre, we've been running this project called the Critical Corporation Project since April 2012. Now, I wanted to just say a welcome to you on behalf of the project as well. So just last month, the Transnational Institute published figures that said that out of the 100 biggest economies of the world, 40 are corporations. So that's not a new number that we've heard before, but it once again reinforces the significance of the corporation and the importance, the urgency for us to look at it. So the Critical Corporation Project is a multidisciplinary critical research project that we started, like I said, in 2012. The idea of a group came out of the fact that although many write about the corporation, and some also do so critically, no one has actually combined the insights of critical scholars from the various disciplines and looked at what synergies might emerge from that. So this project brings together scholars and experts from practice who each work on the corporation from different disciplinary and practical backgrounds. We have anthropologists, sociologists, criminologists, management scholars, lawyers, and trade unionists. Together, we aim to generate responses to the core questions about the corporation and around the corporation, placing the corporation in its context, historically, relationally, internally and externally, philosophically, sociologically, and within the broader context of late capitalism. The questions we ask in the context of this project include: what do we actually mean by the concept of the corporation? In what historical circumstances were its current features developed? What can we say about legalization, financialization, managerialism when seen together? What can we say about corporate-state relations, the role of corporate elites in global governance, the ideological construction of legitimate corporate authority on the global level? What can we say also about resistance against corporate capitalism, the idea of socializing the corporation, and indeed the notion of corporate social responsibility? One of the main aims of this project is to hold public events like this one exactly to engage with a really broad group of people where each of us stands in some relation to the corporation and corporate capitalism, and to exchange views, perspectives and opinions, to learn from each other, and eventually to resolve some of those questions together. Some of the members of the Critical Cooperation Project are in the audience this evening. I can see David White from Liverpool, sociologist. I can see David, our trade unionist. Hugh Wilmot, Professor of Management from Cardiff. So if you're interested in learning more about the project, you can speak to us afterwards. For now, again, a warm welcome from us also.
Okay, so I just want to extremely briefly sort of introduce the background the debate is going to cover. So during the past few years, we've witnessed a veritable meltdown of some of our most vulnerable institutions, ranging from the BBC, Fleet Street, parts of the NHS, and most notably the banks. What's been so striking is how basic standards of responsibility and ethics have been systematically flaunted, some claim. For instance, in ongoing revelations about the LIBOR scandal, we've found out that many tradies were willing to manipulate rates as favours for friends and be rewarded with a bottle of bolly or a steak supper potentially. This scandal, alongside many of the other scandals that have rocked the city, ranging from mis-selling of PPI, so-called wire stripping to disguised money laundering in the case of rogue trading, has resulted in trust in the city plunging to an all-time low. And this is of profound concern to many of us. This has led some commentators to kind of claim that there's a deep problem in the institutions in the city and financial institutions. So we've gone looking for solutions. We're beginning to ask what needs to be done. Some have suggested that changes to regulation is needed. So the FSA is examining these questions now. Some have begun to suggest that the public simply needs to be reminded of how important the city is and all the excellent practices which we already see within the city, which is also an important argument to be put forward. However, there's a growing voice that suggests that the corporations in the UK economy, and particularly banks, need to begin to ask fundamental questions about responsibility and ethics and how these characterise their operations. So according to some, what needs to be done is deeper engagement with questions of corporate social responsibility. It seems like a reasonable argument, and this would be something that many of us would sign up for. But is it? Is corporate social responsibility a meaningful, useful and pertinent way in which to hold corporations like banks to account? Some suspicions have been raised. There's a growing body of evidence that suggests that corporate social responsibility isn't potentially such a good way of holding companies to account. Some say that corporate social responsibility is simply smoke and mirrors, greenwashing or bluewashing, a nice way of presenting a friendly face of corporations to allow them to get on with their activities which they've done in the first place. Some others say that corporate social responsibility is simply a kind of either a waste of time or managers using the company dime to indulge their interests in wildlife conservation, contemporary art collecting, or helping the homeless. For others would say that corporate social responsibility is far more sinister than that. They would say that corporate social responsibility is actually about companies making a land grab to not just sell us products, but to sell us our soul back. So buying a product becomes tantamount to buying a pardon from God above us to some extent. So these suspicions are the kind of things which we want to begin to explore today. We want to ask, is corporate social responsibility a useful way to hold companies to account? Should we dismiss it? And indeed, if we dismiss it, is this throwing the baby out with the bathwater? So to what extent is corporate social responsibility a useful way of holding companies to account? And to do this, we have a wonderful panel in front of us, which I think I'll let Grietje very, very briefly introduce, and then we'll be into the debate. Okay,
great, thanks. To my right, we have Professor Bobby Banerjee, who joined Cass Business School only last week as Professor of Management. Prior to joining Cass, Bobby was Director of Research at the School of Business, University of Western Sydney. He's published widely on topics like CSR, sustainability, post-colonial theory, indigenous ecology, and is the author of Corporate Social Responsibility, the Good, the Bad and the Ugly, published by Edward Elgar. To his right, we have Claire Fauset, who is a former researcher for Corporate Watch, an activist research group. Claire's work focused on climate change, technology and corporate power. She's the author of What's Wrong with Corporate Social Responsibility and Techno Fixes, a Critical Guide to Climate Change Technologies, and I understand she'll be selling copies of those as well. She's currently active in the cooperative movement and on climate change and traveller solidarity, amongst other issues. She's also a performance poet. Then we have Peter Fleming, Professor of Organisation Theory at Queen Mary College School of Business, and soon to join Cass Business School in a month's time. Peter's interests are in the nature of work and employment, the corporation and social responsibility in times of crisis. He has two new books, one of which I've got here, The End of Corporate Social Responsibility, and Dead Men Working, which sounds very interesting also. I'd like to read that. Then we have Eva Jasiewics, who's a union organizer and solidarity activist with experience of working and living in Iraq and Palestine. She has worked with the International Solidarity Movement, the Free Gaza Movement, and has been a representative with the Iraqi Federation of Oil Unions. Most recently, she has been in the news, having spearheaded the Sainsbury's London Living Wage campaign and having occupied a chimney at the EDF gas power station in West Burton for a week recently, shutting down the operation as part of the No Dash for Gas campaign. Very brave action. Then we have Lindsay, who heads up CAFODS. CAFOD is the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, work on the private sector. She leads on the role of business in development and the issue of business and human rights. Her work also includes looking at global supply chains, and she represents CAFOD within the Ethical Trading Initiative. As part of CAFOD's commitment to publish what you pay, Anne is working on a country-by-country reporting requirements for businesses. She's also a director of the Core Coalition for Corporate Responsibility, working on UK corporate accountability in relation to international development, the environment and human rights. Then last but not least, we have Ronen Shamir, who is a professor of sociology and law at Tel Aviv University. He has been publishing extensively on the subject of CSR and also recently on CSR in conflict zones. He has an upcoming book on the electrification of Palestine, looking at the interface of the Palestine Electric Corporation and colonial interest during the 1920s. On another line, he has published a lot about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from a social, legal, and CSR perspective. All right, so now we're just going to have about 8 minutes for everyone to speak, and then we'll have a very short break, after which we'll have Q&A. Then we will put up our question again, a question of whether CSR still offers a meaningful tool to hold corporations to account, on which you will get a chance to vote with the electronic gadgets you've hopefully been handed out at the entrance. So I
should note that we've purposely, some of you might be sort of interested, but we've purposely got a group of people who you don't normally find speaking in business schools tonight to bring some controversy to the debate, I think. So that's the idea. It's Friday night evening, controversy is good. Okay, so hopefully we'll start off with the very controversial Professor Banerjee.
I'll stand up for this. I'm sitting on there. First, thank you for coming, folks. I could be think of a lot more interesting things I could be doing on a Friday afternoon. I've been studying CSR for the last 20 plus years, and my main finding is this: CSR is like teenage sex. Everybody says they're doing it, but in reality, very few are. And those that are doing it rather badly. So to answer the question, does CSR offer a real opportunity to hold corporations into account? My instinctive response, based on my work, is to say no. But being an academic, I will give the traditional academic response to any question, which is to say, it depends. Now, if you look at the evolution of CSR from the early 1950s, it's not that new. It's been around for almost 80, 70 years now. We can discern two narratives about the role of corporations in society. One school of thought argues that corporations are incorrigibly guided by self-interest. This, of course, is best exemplified by the Milton Friedman school of thought, with its almost tiresome cliche that the business of business is business. Peter Drucker, one of the earliest management gurus, once said in an interview just before he died, CSR is a, and I quote, CSR is a dangerous distortion of business principles. If you find an executive who wants to take on social responsibilities, fire him fast. So this narrative is primarily an economic one, focusing on efficiency. There is yet another narrative which claims that corporations have an enduring capacity to operate on the basis of civic virtue. This is a much more sociological narrative in content and form, in that it focuses on the legitimacy of corporations and argues that corporations exist because society gives them the right to do so, and consequently, corporations have certain responsibilities because they're given that right. Again, best exemplified by a statement made by the descendant of Henry Ford, William Ford Jr., who's the chairman and CEO and president of the Ford Motor Company, who said last year that corporations could and should be a major force for resolving environmental and social concerns in the 21st century. So now we've got two views here. So we either have this notion that these corporations are these evil creatures, maximizing efficiency, despoiling the environment, exploiting anyone and everything, lowering workers' wages, all to maximize profits, or we have corporations as a force of good, spreading sweetness and light and democracy throughout the world. The truth, as it normally does, lies somewhere in between. So let's look at how do these two themes of efficiency and legitimacy play out in corporations. See, the problem with the efficiency and legitimacy dichotomy, as is the problem with all dichotomies, is that it is often the case that one category tends to define the other. So in this case of CSR, legitimacy becomes discursively constructed by the parameters of efficiency. So which is why much of CSR is about win-win. We will do good for the environment, we will do good for society, provided we make money doing it, or we save money doing it. So that's the classic win-win situation. And this is why we have a complex issue like sustainability suddenly become transformed into eco-efficiency. That's the only way we can make sense out of it. So the CSR literature is replete with win-win situations, which I find really boring because it is strangely silent on what happens when it's a win-lose. What happens when a corporation accumulates wealth at the expense of society? What happens when it accumulates wealth through dispossession, through death, through torture? For me, I find that much more interesting. So I guess for me, my question is, what are the conditions in the political economy that allow corporations to accumulate wealth at the expense of society? And more importantly, how can corporations and the economy be governed to prevent environmental and social damage? So basically what I'm arguing is that the corporation in its current form, I emphasize, in its current form, is an inappropriate vehicle for positive social change. Perhaps there is some transformative potential, but we'll have to wait and see, and I personally am not going to hold my breath. The current global explosion of interest in CSR may be a good thing, but I see some troubling aspects. My own interpretation of the explosion of CSR all over the world is that CSR has now become an ideological movement intended to legitimize the power of large transnational corporations. In some of my current research projects involving the extractive industries in indigenous communities, I'm seeing a very dark side of CSR, where mining corporations are deploying CSR as a weapon to circumvent legislation, to counter local tribal resistance movements against mining, often with the active collusion of very often corrupt governments in those regions. So if we do have to have a more progressive and radical CSR agenda, I think we should forget about looking inside the corporation. I think we need to start looking at the outside forces that shape what a corporation does. We need to study the interaction of market, state, and civil society actors that constitute the political economy of CSR if we are to hold corporations to account. Otherwise, if you follow the logical end of the argument, we can end up with a scenario where a corporation is responsible for everything but accountable for nothing. And I think that's precisely where we are going, unfortunately. There is a need to recover and re-embed the social in the political economy. Because in the current neoliberal political economy that dominates our life, there has been an economic capture of the social. The real fundamental challenge today in neoliberal economy is not the antisocial effects of the economic market, but of the anti-competitive effects of society. And I think that needs to be transformed. And the way this can be done, because we're talking about a reconciliation between economic, environmental, and social interests, and ultimately this reconciliation is a political task, because it involves structures and processes of power. So the key issue then in enforcing CSR and corporate accountability is more democratic governance of the political economy. I don't mean corporations should be democracies. There are many institutions which are not democracies. The church is not a democracy. The UN is not a democracy. Dare I say, universities are not democracies. So, but the issue is really how is the political economy to be governed in a more democratic way. So the problem is, perhaps, and I don't mean to sound controversial, perhaps democracy is overrated in terms of the way we're living right now, because we're living in a democracy without choices, where as citizens of sovereign states, we can use the ballot box to change ruling political parties, but have very little or no say in how to influence public policies that are eroding people's capabilities and rights. So making corporations more accountable can only happen if there is more democratic governance. Right. Let me end with the profound words of the great American philosopher, Woody Allen, who once said, more than any other time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly.
I'm going to use some slides, so just bear with me a sec. And how do I... Thanks a lot. Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Claire Fauset. I am a researcher with Corporate Watch, and in 2006 I published this report here called What's Wrong with Corporate Social Responsibility. So what I'm saying is going to be partly taken from that. To start with a quote. So the 20th century has been characterised by three developments of great political importance: the growth of democracy, the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate propaganda to protect corporate power against democracy. Now, I think we can call this propaganda CSR, and we can call the ideology that it's seeking to protect neoliberalism. And I called CSR propaganda because it's a lie, because of what a corporation is. A corporation, directors of a corporation have a duty to protect the interests of shareholders above all other interests, a duty to make profits above all other concerns. Now, generally we term social responsibility to mean putting the interests of society above your own personal interests. So with CSR, we have a complete reversal of conventional moral priorities. CSR is propaganda because it exists to defend the license to operate that corporations have, the permission that society gives them to exist and to act in the way they do. And it creates a belief, it exists to create this belief that corporations can do something about their harmful impacts, and that they can be a force for good, and that they can address them, to sort of say, it's all right, we've got it in hand, you don't need to worry about these issues. And it's a distraction from the fact that corporations exist to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few already rich individuals. And that the capitalist system depends on the ever-increasing consumption of mostly finite resources. And that is by definition unsustainable. And sustainability, in the kind of parlance of CSR, has become to mean sustained growth. But that's actually the opposite of what sustainability actually means. So here's another quote from Paul Polman, who's the CEO of Unilever. He says, "It's all very well saying that our ice cream cabinets have natural refrigerants, but the company's Magnum still needs to be priced right and it still needs to taste good." This is a picture of Magnum for anyone who's never had a Magnum in their life. So CSR takes as its starting point the Magnum. So this is the product that's the starting point of CSR. And it's the starting point from which we can create a more just and sustainable world. So we've got the Magnum, and it's priced a certain way and it tastes a certain way. And CSR asks the question, how can we reduce the amount of energy that goes into producing this Magnum? And how we manufacture and sell it? How can we make sure that the workers aren't so unhappy that they go on strike? How can we make sure that we can reduce the amount of pollution or animal exploitation that goes into the production of this Magnum? So basically it's saying, how do we change things without actually changing things? The Magnum shouldn't be the point that we take as a starting point when we're trying to avert the climate crisis, make our society sustainable and humane and equitable for all of its inhabitants. If we take the starting point for those kind of questions about the world we want to live in as the Magnum, then we're not going to get anywhere. So what is the debate that we're trying to have here? And for me, I think that the people on this panel are all generally agreed that CSR can't do anything about the problem of corporate power, which is at the root of all of these major social and environmental crises that we're facing at the moment. So the question really for this panel is, should we content ourselves with the kind of victories that CSR can win? Can corporate power be curbed? And would it be mutually exclusive to adopt both of these strategies at the same time? And I think that final question is what we're really trying to get to the crux of with this debate. So should we make do with small change? I think that the key thing here is the scale of the problem. We're facing a situation where every living system in the world is in decline, where you've got a problem when even the renewable resources, like the forests, like the fisheries and so on, are running out. That's by definition unsustainable. Climate change is a major issue. We're looking at, can we actually sort our society out so that we can continue to live on this planet with the size of population that we have? So it's a pretty fundamental crisis, and it's one that CSR has absolutely nothing to say about. The bank bailouts just go to show how much this economy, the governments, will do anything to maintain the system as it is rather than change it. So the question I posed before was, can corporate power be curbed? And if it can, who's going to do it? Is it going to be the corporations? Well, I think it's absurd to expect corporations to be a curb on corporate power, but that's exactly what CSR is proposing to do. It's proposing to use corporate power to create change rather than opposing and challenging the corporate power that's at the root of the problems we're trying to address. Is the state going to curb corporate power? Well, CSR came about largely as a strategy to avoid regulation. The Norwegian and Swedish governments were proposing at the original Earth Summit to have binding laws to regulate transnationals. And that quickly moved into being voluntary mechanisms. So I don't think the state is going to do that. I think that all political parties in the UK have a strong neoliberal ideology, and the corporations and the government are the same people. You just have to look at the number of millionaires in the cabinet to see that. And we can't just lobby them to control the corporate elites. We have a state which sees competitiveness and economic growth as its raison d'etre. It's not going to challenge that fundamentally. So maybe it's the consumers that have the power to control corporations. I think that this quote really winds me up. Every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world you want. If you're going to cast a vote for the kind of world you want, this is like the opposite of democracy. This is where the rich get the most votes. So I believe that if you want to vote for the kind of world you want, you have to act with something other than your wallets. Consumer power as a kind of curb on corporations is quite illusory, because the consumer is manufactured by the corporation. The consumer is the role that corporations most want us to take on. They don't want to take us on the role of the citizen, where we might actually have power. It's the consumer is a kind of a tool of the corporation. So maybe if it's not the consumer, maybe it's the people. And I'd like to see us much more see ourselves in that light, rather than as consumers. I think with the bailout of the banks, it's become more and more acceptable, socially acceptable, to be anti-capitalist. And if corporate power is the problem, and state power is in corporate hands, then I think people power has to become an effective challenge to corporate power. And social movements on the streets, they may not appear to have a unified theory of what they want, but they certainly have a unified theory of what they don't want. And I think that if we're going to challenge capitalism, we have to look for the cracks within it and drive a wedge into them and push them open further. So I've called CSR the homeopathy of social change. So are the two mutually exclusive? Do you have to challenge corporate power? Can you also be okay with CSR existing? Well, I think CSR is a sugar coating for neoliberalism. And I don't think it's just useless, I think it's also harmful, because I think it's a propaganda that shores up corporate power and shores up the legitimacy of the corporation. So, and the business case of CSR is that we all believe in it, basically. That's why I call it homeopathy, because it only makes profits for them if we all believe in it. So if we're going to actually challenge corporate power, then CSR is more than a distraction. It's the opposite strategy. It's actually going the wrong way. Thanks.
I might speak just sitting down. I don't know about you. I'm starting to get very depressed. Is anyone going to support this proposition? I've written a book called The End of Corporate Social Responsibility. I want to defend it now. It's like a stray dog where we've got it in the corner, we're all kicking. Right, okay. So I guess I'm going to continue with the criticism, I guess, of CSR as something that is probably inadequate and never really designed to hold a corporation accountable, especially when things go wrong, and they do seem to be going wrong quite a lot now. I guess what I might try and do then is to kind of put a little bit of an optimistic spin on things, is look at points of possibility, I guess. So at least we're asking the question. And the question has been broached, which is an important question about whether the main ethical discourse in which we tend to, business people, but many other people outside of business, talk about the ethicality of business, at least we're asking around questions about its efficacy, which I think is an important thing. So is CSR useful to hold corporations to account? I guess it would be nice if that was the case. So let's first of all talk about some of the reasons why that might not be the case. And I think the previous two speakers have raised important points about why that is, why that makes for a difficult proposition. And I guess with the rise of CSR since the early 90s as a full-blown discourse, it's had its chance, I guess. It's had its chance. And surveying the global political economy at the moment, it doesn't make for pretty reading. In the post-Enron era, the failure of the Rio 20 Plus Earth Summit, The BP Gulf of Mexico oil spill. BP puts millions of pounds into its CSR policy, so it doesn't make for a successful track record, I guess. And also the very question, hold corporations to account. I think this is part of the problem in which we're casting CSR, because it's kind of like this post-factum watchdog. So after there's the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, along comes CSR and says, okay, we're going to hold you to account. And oftentimes it's used within the business world, in particular by the multinational corporation, as an excuse to say, okay, we'll try better next time. At least we've got a policy, and we'll try better next time. We're making progress. And of course, the pattern seems to be one more disaster, one more scandal, and it seems difficult to see CSR actually having teeth in that way. Whether CSR also can be hold corporations to accountable, from speaking to managers and to human resource managers in particular, who are very, very supportive of CSR, and workers and consumers, I'm starting to wonder whether anyone really believes in the efficacy of CSR. It seems to have this inbuilt cynicism in which one must take a slight distance from the actual precepts and prescriptions of the CSR policy. In other words, we've got a CSR policy, but don't take it too seriously. Don't take it too seriously. And that's a point of possibility of maybe using it to make some progressive change. What would happen if you took it very, very seriously? What would happen if you took the prescriptions of CSR by the rule? A work to rule, if you like, of CSR. Oh, I kind of like that. I might jot that down. A work to rule, a CSR work to rule. That would be quite interesting, and that may be a point of usefulness. And also, I think at the moment, one problem with the use of corporate social responsibility as a mechanism of accountability is that we seem to be emerging into a new era. I wouldn't say it's almost post-neoliberalism, if that's an actual concept, in which there seems to be a dominant capitalist realism in which it's impervious to criticism. The ideological justifications for example, the libel scandal, etc., seems to be coming to an end. In other words, it's almost as if large corporations are saying, "We'll do it. There's nothing you can do about it. We're not going to try and justify it. There's nothing you can do about it. We run the show. What are you going to do about it?" So there seems to be this kind of post-ideological moment in which even the justifications, which used to be social democracy, it used to be wealth creation, it used to be jobs, it used to be bringing the living standard up for various countries, aren't even wheeled out anymore. And so the idea of CSR kind of being used to account for or to hold corporations accountable comes up against this capitalist realism that I think is increasingly impervious and really not bothered by the ethical criticisms that it receives, which I find probably the most worrying thing, to be honest. So I think the real question should not necessarily be, is CSR useful to hold corporations to account? Maybe we could kind of spin the question and make it a little bit more of a happy ending, I guess. Under what conditions could CSR hold corporations to account? And what would those conditions look like? Are those conditions embodied within the CSR discourse itself, or would we have to go somewhere else for it? And I think that would probably be a more productive question to ask. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of play with the question and talk about how we would apply CSR and how I, in my own work as a union organiser, have tried to apply CSR or tried to hold major companies to account. I work for Unite the Union. I'm here in a personal capacity, but I work for the biggest union in this country, 1.5 million members, mostly private sector, blue collar. The workers that I work with are mostly minimum wage, migrant, hyper-casualised workers, and trying to win for them. And I think we need to complicate necessarily the idea of winning, and I think that unions actually can have quite a short-sighted idea of what it means to win, which reinforces the myth of corporate social responsibility. So in this whole debate, when we're talking about who are the actors to really dismantle capitalism, let me put my cards on the table, that's what my agenda is. Who are the actors that are going to do that? Who's going to actually do that? And when we're talking about trade unions, which are immensely powerful, do they have a contradiction to deal with? And in my opinion, they do. So, I mean, in some cases, for example, has anyone here heard of the Ethical Trading Initiative? You all have, okay. So this is over 10 years old. It was brought together by charities, NGOs, and the business community. Now, sometimes this ETI base code is what we try and arm ourselves with as organisers when it comes to negotiations. There was one warehouse in southeast London where workers were picking and packing for one of the biggest supermarkets in this country. A supermarket which really prides itself on its family values. And these workers were actually unable to see their families a lot of the time because the system that was operating there was one of major hyper-casualisation, 5 different employment agencies. Some workers were working for 2 agencies. They were flexed up, flexed down, and switched off by these agencies at will. So a human being is switched off like a machine. You come into work, we don't need you, goodbye. And you don't get paid for that. This is seen as acceptable. When we try and apply the ETI base code in this context, what we try and talk about is that a living wage is paid, because often these workers aren't making enough to live on. They're paid the minimum wage, but sometimes the agencies take deductions for housing or for transportation or for other elements of the work that they're doing. So the living wage is definitely not being paid. And if we take the living wage campaign's idea of what a living wage is, I think is it £8.53 now in London, and I can't remember what it is in the rest of the country. There are no supermarkets that are signed up to the ETI that are actually paying this living wage, not even to their front of house staff, but all the more so to the invisible staff. And the problem with CSR is that it really focuses on a kind of a visible, kind of fluffy aspect of what a corporation can do: build a school, build a clinic, while at the same time pillaging a community's resources. In the case of some of these supermarkets, take the workers on a holiday, do some nice fluffy competitions. Things that might have a public face, or sponsorship. Do some of these companies are massively involved or have been involved in sponsoring the Queen's Jubilee or the Olympics. But the invisibility of the people who are very exploited by these companies, that they are untouched by CSR, and CSR cannot fulfill their desires or their needs. Even if we wanted to apply CSR using the Ethical Trading Initiative base code, which also includes, it's not just that the living wage is paid, but also that trade union rights are respected. If you take one of the signatories, Associated British Foods, which owns Primark, the production process involved in, this isn't Primark, but let's take, for example, producing a dress, goes through so many different companies and passes through so many different hands, from very little hands, and for example, Tamil refugee camps in Tirupur in India, all the way through, the hands of packers in warehouses in the southeast of England, to lorry drivers driving this merchandise to the Primark store, to the actual workers themselves who might be on workfare. How does CSR cope with that? Someone isn't even being paid a minimum wage. So the application of it is not even possible. Another really clear example, and I think the starkest example, is basically energy companies. And when we're talking about climate change, if we look at the example of this government's policy, currently understood to be known as the Dash for Gas, which involves making the UK dependent on gas for over 50% of its energy requirements, and involves building up to 40 new gas-fired power stations. Now, the big 6 energy companies that dominate our domestic energy system will be part of that, and they will be involved in building these gas-fired power stations. Now, scientific opinion, climate change organisations, people in the global south are all committed to a reduction in carbon emissions that this country will not meet if it pursues this Dash for Gas. But these companies will be going for it. Now, they will have their corporate social responsibility policies, but the actual business that they want to engage in will crash that CSR policy, and will crash our climate targets, and also plunge people much further into fuel poverty. Just as an aside, if we are dependent on gas in this country, the average household bill will go up by £600 annually. By 2020, if we go renewables, it will be £100. So it has great implications for people at the bottom. So how, application of CSR to the dash for gas would mean stopping it completely, which is completely antithetical to the profit motive. And what we're actually asking these companies to do is to abandon these reserves, abandon these plans, go into a different direction, which will also have its problems. But what you're asking a company to do is completely counter to the motive that it has to exist and develop and grow. And Claire's talked about that a bit. The complicating factor, I probably have like 1 minute left, don't I? Okay. Good point to finish on is trade unions. I don't know what the union's plans are for a relationship to the dash for gas. I know that my union does represent workers at EDF and other energy companies. So when a union is looking at this policy, there is a self-interest there which says, okay, these workers are going to be working there. We're looking at a new workforce of thousands, building this infrastructure, operating this infrastructure. We need to get them in the union. That's kind of the thinking, rather than actually, no, we want to be part of stopping this. So there's a contradiction to the interests of another type of corporation. Trade unions do function in some ways like a corporation. They need to have a turnover. They need to serve, just as corporations serve their shareholders, their own members' interests. And just as we saw with the third runway at Heathrow, those members' interests were, we want the third runway. Never mind that it will flatten and, well, it will wipe out Sipson Village, including a graveyard and homes for the people there. So we've got to be careful about the kind of actors that we're dealing with. And my parting point on this is that we need to, I think I'd really like to see our debate go in the direction of, how do we end corporate monopoly, and how do we end the idea of certain aspects of our lives being actual commodities, being marketable. Can we reclaim a commons, water, our atmosphere, energy? These shouldn't actually be commodities. They shouldn't be subject to market forces. These should be rights. So I'd like to see a kind of rights-based discourse emerge from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's Lindsay, and as was said in the introduction, I work for a development agency, CAFOD. I'm also one of the directors of the Core Corporate Responsibility Coalition. And it's a real privilege to be able to take part and hear all the views we've had to date. I just want to emphasise that for me, my day-to-day role is looking at taking quite a pragmatic approach. So how can we work with our partner organisations in different developing countries to reduce harmful impacts by certain businesses? So I'm going to share some of my reflections based on that work in response to the question, does CSR offer a real opportunity to hold corporations to account? So these are my personal reflections based on the last 8 years. My short answer to the question would be no, but I'm obviously going to spend a little bit longer explaining why I think that, and maybe highlight some areas of perhaps what I'd call the CSR age, where I think there have been some useful developments. But if we are truly in the end times now, I want to talk about the steps that could help us to move to the next stage, when I'd argue that we need to be thinking a lot more about corporate accountability than CSR. So as a development agency, the kind of situations that the local groups we work with are in might be the oil and gas industry in Timor-Leste, gold, copper mining in Peru, Colombia, Zambia and Honduras, or export processing zones in Mexico for the US market. And in these contexts, we'd not only work with local groups to try to influence government policies and laws and how they're enforced, but we would also talk directly to companies and industry groups where we think that there is a reasonable chance that this could lead to some improvement. And in my talk, I've got that bit in bold because, to be honest, we constantly need to be evaluating those kind of discussions and dialogues to see if we're having any impact at all. And it's in this area that we come most directly into contact with CSR. So obviously, the concept means different things to different people, and some of our Francophone colleagues would certainly see it as a stronger term which includes the idea of regulation. In my experience, a kind of a model of CSR where this is above all voluntary is it can deliver some positive outcomes in certain situations, but it's certainly not a good tool for corporate accountability. And I would argue that that's because it's a one-sided concept which can be incredibly selective, allows the company to frame the debate and the issues and opt in and out. And I just wanted to share now maybe some of the results that we've seen of that over the years. Firstly, I think there's both a deluge and a dearth of information. So I've given up on the number of CSR or sustainability reports that I've been sent to read. But in practice, key information about corporate activities that can have a really big impact of some of the communities we work with is missing from the publicly available data. And then we also get the strange situation where some of the, perhaps we'd say slightly more progressive companies, perhaps in the garment sector or the electronics, are the ones that admit that they found problems in their supply chains, when in fact other companies will have exactly the same problems, but perhaps they don't know about it or don't admit to it. And a point that was mentioned earlier about the role of the consumer, I'm also very sceptical about that. I think it does then put pressure on certain companies with brands and a consumer interface, but then other companies with just as much influence are very much let off the hook. We can see that a little bit with the example of Foxconn, for example, one of the contract manufacturers in the first tier of the electronic industry that's only now starting to come under pressure. Second point, I think that our experience is just how incredibly resource intensive CSR initiatives can be, often with very limited impact. So if we've got to justify our time and the time that our partners spend, if we're looking at issues such as wages, precarious work on temporary contracts, freedom to organise, safe working conditions, we really haven't made the progress that we should have done. And on these issues, I'd say in the work that we've done with the electronics companies, I'd characterise the progress as being glacial. So there has been some progress, but incredibly slow for the time and effort. And I would highlight a problem with CSR is often you're talking to a very committed person within the organisation who's at a level where they don't have the power or the resources to actually make significant changes. So this can mean that CSR becomes an elaborate sideshow to the real business priorities. So we have to keep thinking, well, is our time perhaps better spent bringing a legal case or campaigning for or indeed against a change to the law? Then the third point, linking to the question, I think the link with accountability is incredibly tenuous. And I would say CSR is responsible for the rise of the stakeholders. And this is a word that I admit I really hate. I hate being described as a stakeholder or engaged with as one. And why is that? You know, what does it really mean? The company, again, chooses its stakeholders. And in public policy terms, the use of stakeholder blurs the relationships that different groups have with the company. So it implies that all groups are equal, they're all stakeholders, when clearly they're not. Investors, employees, suppliers, their employees, communities, all have a different relationship, different power relationship with the company, and it's a mistake to try and pretend that they're somehow the same. Then fourth point is I think there's a danger of distraction from real changes which would reduce harmful activities by business and also require action from a much broader range of businesses. And, you know, I'm slightly characterising the discussion, but we've all been in situations where someone said, oh, well, we don't need regulation, we've got good practice case studies. And I think positive projects and initiatives are great, but what's quite worrying is when they're used as a reason not to address harm. And this is something that I think we in the development community also need to be aware of. And then finally, I think I'd just like to mention that the reality of the situation for very vulnerable people can get lost very quickly in a CSR discourse. So in countries where we work and partner activists in Philippines and in Honduras who've been campaigning against mining activities are facing death threats on a daily basis. And some of CAFOD's partners in Peru were actually arrested and charged for peaceful protests near a mine last year. So for many people, this literally is a life and death issue. And that's where I become very uneasy when, for example, at the UN Forum in Geneva in December, we're talking about the business case for human rights. What happens when there isn't a business case, when it's not going to be a win-win? So it's clear that I think there are obvious limitations to the CSR approach, but I also wanted to try and end in a slightly more positive direction. So pick out some elements, I think, not from the concept, but from the broader debate that has occurred over the last decade or so. I do think that there has been increased understanding within different businesses of how their business model impacts on the environment and society, and also increased awareness that there is external interest in those impacts. I do think that in some contexts, multi-stakeholder initiatives can be helpful in creating shared knowledge of how different business impacts impact on worker, communities, the environment, bringing together different expertise and knowledge because, for example, from an NGO perspective, we certainly don't know the ins and outs of how the business works. But by bringing different groups together, I think you can produce shared knowledge. And then my final point is being really pragmatic. Sometimes you just have to go with what you've got. Some of these questions are often very urgent. We might be campaigning for a change in the law and challenging concepts such as CSR. But if you can't get a change in the law and international standards aren't being enforced, then sometimes using a company's own public position and commitments might be the best way that you can try and press for a change, for example, using investors and shareholder relationships. So to finish off, I think it will be clear from my presentation that, to be honest, I would be quite happy if we were talking about the death of CSR, but I think that probably is premature. But what are the steps that we can take to hasten it on its way, and what should come next? So just to close 5 points, I think, firstly, I'm very happy to take part in an event like this. We'll see what discussion and debate we have afterwards. But I think being open about the limitations of a CSR approach, and the core coalition in the UK and CAFOD prefer to talk about concepts of corporate accountability. And I think that's more helpful for this idea of holding businesses to account. Also, I think the concept which is being developed, discussions around business and human rights, is again much better than talking about CSR, because I think it's much better being a rights holder than being a stakeholder. At least it's a kind of two-way discussion about people whose rights are being affected. Secondly, I think evidence and analysis linked to specific industries, countries and companies plays a really important point here, looking at the impacts of core business practices. And here I do see an opportunity to scale up from some of the more useful multi-stakeholder initiatives. So, for example, CAFOD's one of the organisations which is supporting a change in the law now being debated at European level, and it matches a disclosure requirement introduced in the US for extractive industries in 2010 that came out some of the learning from a multi-stakeholder initiative on the extractive industries. And then my final point, I think, is one which has come through in various ways with the other speakers. It's looking at changing the political debate, involving citizens, politicians, businessmen and women as well, academics. I think we do need to change laws so that the framework is there to support accountability rather than depending on CSR. And for us, I think two important issues are access to reliable, accurate information and access to justice in terms of, where appropriate, being able to bring court cases against multinationals. And it's essential that we can have that discussion and try to reframe the debate. We need to be very open that recognising that businesses can have very negative consequences as well as positive ones is not being anti-business, it's being realistic. Thank you.
Thank you. I humbly beg to steal a minute before my time of allocation, simply that until this afternoon I did not know how optimistic I was about CSR. And we promised a debate. So here's one. For example, I naively assumed until today that Corporate Watch, one of the premises of Corporate Watch as an organization was the CSR agenda. So it's like I felt like as if an Amnesty person would come and say that human rights are propaganda and small change only. So I'm looking forward to a debate. Okay, time me. No. I would like to probe a bit into the interface of CSR and the case of Palestine. And my purpose is not to discuss issues of efficacy. This can go on forever, but instead I want to consider a bit the underlying logic that I see at work when it comes to CSR and Palestine. But first, let me say something briefly about what I mean by CSR. So first of all, when I'm talking about CSR here, I'm talking about CSR and human rights in zones of conflict, which, if you like, it's a field on its own, okay? CSR and human rights in zones of conflict. Further, I specifically refer, and maybe narrowly refer, to an emergent, when I talk about CSR, human rights, I specifically refer to an emergent international regime that finds expression in initiatives and declarations, the two most important of which are the UN Global Compact and the UN Guidelines on Business and Human Rights. Now, of course, this does not exhaust the scope of activities undertaken under the banner of CSR and human rights, but I think that such initiatives represent the advance of CSR in recent years, gaining silently, slowly, but gaining some status in international forums and international law that is directly or indirectly sanctioned by governments, not only by civil society. Okay, and I think it's an important development that such a regime is emerging. Now, again, a confession. For years, I almost automatically got used to classify myself as suspicious towards CSR, with the familiar critiques. It's voluntary, it's non-enforceable, it's based on business case model, etc., etc. And I think I'm pretty versed in the critiques. But honestly, when I look at the relationship between this emergent regime that I'm talking about and some of the developments in Palestine, or Israel-Palestine, I'm far from celebrating it, but I think that we look at some interesting and somewhat impressive achievements. And I would like to be a little bit specific. I would limit myself to two recent, I think, important developments. One was in October 2012, when the report of Grietje Falk came out. It's a report, Grietje Falk was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council to report, among other things, I cite, upon the human rights and international humanitarian law obligations and principles relevant to private corporations in the occupied Palestinian territory. The report, quite a long report and detailed report, relied specifically, explicitly relied on the Global Compact and the UN guiding principles that I just mentioned as a major yardstick for evaluating corporate activity in the occupied territories. The most basic premise of the report was that, again, I cite that businesses should support and respect the protection of internationally proclaimed human rights and ensure that they are not complicit in human rights abuses. Just to give you a sense, the report focused on about a dozen corporations, Motorola, Caterpillar, and Hewlett-Packard from American-based, Veolia from France, G4S from the UK, Dexia from Belgium, Assa Abloy and Volvo from Sweden, Riwal Holding Group from the Netherlands, and 3 Israeli corporations. Most, if not all, these corporations have extensive codes of conduct and are signatories to the Global Compact. But the report found that these corporations compromise their human rights obligations. For example, again, just to give you a sense, Caterpillar supplying heavy machinery, which is used in the construction of settlements, Veolia, among other things, in operating buses, linking and servicing settlements, G4S, through its Israeli subsidiary in providing security equipment and expertise to settlements, security installations, and checkpoints in the occupied territory. And all this, of course, I should add, and the report mentioned, is a drop in the ocean. But I think that the mere fact that such reports of the United Nations are coming out and create and establish a specific, explicit link between CSR and corporations operating in Israeli-Palestine is not a trivial point. It's some form of progress, simply because 10 years ago we could not have dreamed about it, or we could only dream about it. The report also praises corporations that have taken steps to minimize their complicity. For example, Falk writes that, again, I cite, it is encouraging to be informed that Assa Abloy has moved its multi-T-locks factory from the West Bank to Israel. I will come back to it in a minute, this move from the West Bank to Israel. And it is encouraging that the Dexia Group, G4S, and Cemex are looking for ways to bring their operations into line with their commitments under the UN Global Compact. A second development was just last week, the United Nations Human Rights Council published its report that made quite a few headlines. It's called the Report of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission to Investigate the Implications of the Israeli Settlements on the Civil, Political, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of the Palestinian People. It endorsed the Falk report. It devoted a whole chapter to corporations within the overall framework. And I would like to read out to you the conclusions of the report, section 17. It's very brief. The recommendations of the report was articulated like this. Private companies must assess the human rights impact of their activities and take all necessary steps, including by terminating their business interests in the settlements to ensure that they are not adversely impacting the human rights of the Palestinian people in conformity with international law, as well as with the guiding principles on business and human rights that I just cited. Okay. Now, again, what I'm trying to say is I'm not celebrating it. I'm moving to my second point. I want to point out the particularity of the interface in this specific instance between CSR and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. There is something interesting, I think, going on here. What ties all the instances that are reported in the report, what ties all these instances together is not any particular violation of human rights, but the very fact that business activities takes place in the occupied territories across what is known as the Green Line. In other words, the violation or the presumed violation of human rights in these cases is embedded in a reality of an enduring military occupation. It is not any specific character or any particular commercial activity, but the geographic allocation of that activity which matters here, okay? Which is, I think it's interesting, and I will try to explain why. What is really at stake here is actually the agenda here is the termination of the occupation by market means. That is, the expectation of CSR here is not simply that a given corporation would avoid a human right violation, but that the accumulated impact of such avoidance will eventually affect the policies of Israel and will bring about a political change. So it's quite an ambitious agenda. That's what I'm trying to say. And again, I'm not saying it's good or bad or it will be successful or unsuccessful. I'm trying, first of all, to say something about the nature, the underlying logic that is at work here. What corporations are actually expected to do is to take active part in redrawing the green line by pulling out for whatever business with Israel or Israelis they have in the occupied territories. And the specific technique which is envisioned here is that of corporations being able to sort out and sever a perceived occupation economy from the Israeli economy per se. In other words, the task corporations are called upon to perform is not merely technical but conceptual, to imagine an Israeli market which can be marked and demarcated apart from the economic activities in the occupied territories. And this is not trivial, because the market on the ground does not stop at the green line. On the ground, the market behaves as one. Okay? So what we have here is a case where corporations are perceived not simply as quasi-sovereigns able to police their own business, but as more than quasi-sovereigns which are able to draw political boundaries by economic means. Okay, again, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I want to point out a possible paradox that may come with assigning corporations with the responsibility to redraw the green line. Perhaps, for example, abstaining from directly operating across the green line, to the extent that it is possible at all, may end up legitimizing all other corporate dealings with Israel in ways that may further sustain the occupation without them being recognized as such, because they're done through Israel. And once we are set on this road of questioning the underlying logic of CSR, here is another complication. In political terms, mobilizing the action models of CSR in order to redraw the green line to mark a border is to validate one very specific way of ending the occupation. Because whether we agree or not, or endorse it or not, there are other political visions on the table. The green line is not some sacred border. It is no more and no less than a 1949 armistice line. Yet again, harnessing corporations to the task of validating the green line is a task that assigns corporations with the task of endorsing one political solution among others for ending the occupation. So to sum up, on the one hand, I see what I can call very impressive achievements at the level of international law and the United Nations involvement with CSR. And on the other hand, I see paradoxes and new options for evasion and tasks that may exhaust the power of CSR. So I guess my position here is to be somewhat ambivalent. Okay.
Okay, well, will you all sort of come back into the room and take a space? hopefully during the break you've had some time to formulate questions. One thing I must admit that I was very surprised about was how, in sense, unanimous our panel was. It's very strange, and it was very surprising to me. I hope that we would have some who would be arguing a fervent case. So what I'm hoping from the floor is more kind of for the question, and also I think what's also needed is business perspective on this as well. It's a little bit missing to some extent. So what we'd like from the floor is we can be statements or questions. I think probably short statements. So these two gentlemen here as a start.
My name's Dwayne Barracker. I work for business in the community, so I feel a little like the devil in this discussion. But I spend most of my time with executives talking about CSR. And one of the reflections I have on that is that CSR is the only forum or the only theme that gives me access to executives and lets them discuss the question of what the role of corporations is in society. And I have another comment and a question. I want to ask each of you to identify how Hippocratic you are. And I'm a hypocrite as well. How many of you know how many human rights violations were committed within the production, shipping, whatever, of the clothes you're currently wearing now? And it's a really interesting question to think about. And I also want to ask, if it's not none of you defined corporate social responsibility. So in a sense, you all win and you all lose this debate. But if it's not corporate social responsibility that offers us a meaningful opportunity, what are the top three in your views? And you'll have all very different views, because if I invited you to each come to a definition of corporate social responsibility, I bet I could walk out the door now, come back Monday morning, and you wouldn't have cracked it by the time I got back in terms of getting to a consensus position on that. Thank you.
Anthony Williams, I'm a visiting professor here, and I have spent some time in business and various other things as well. I felt that I was listening to, with the possible exception of the first and last speaker, people answering a totally different question. In what ways does corporate social responsibility utterly fail to provide any opportunity at all to hold corporations to account? So I didn't get much impression of addressing the question that was posed. A couple of other things I didn't hear dealt with at all, and that is the role of fund managers in dealing with this issue. Now, I think we can probably agree that increasing profitability and shareholder value are not necessarily congruent with high standards of corporate social responsibility. However, they can certainly damage profitability and shareholder value very considerably because of the reputational impact that bad or failure in corporate social responsibility can have. So I think we need to look rather more in a slightly more nuanced way at the role of investors in this area. They are not all heartless monsters, and in fact the bulk of the fund managers that I have encountered through the International Corporate Governance Network and elsewhere have clear policies on promoting corporate social responsibility, which some of you may think is an absurdity, in the areas that they invest. So I think a little broader view would be very welcome.
We'll take one more voice. Yep.
I just wanted to add to that and just say back to Peter Fleming's comment earlier about what conditions does CSR hold corporations to account. I think that's one of the key points. Sorry, my name is Lindsay. And I think one of the key things is that CSR is changing, but I don't think that the
I'm Katie Hardiman. I work at Good Business. I also work with senior management and CR professionals from large organisations, big corporates included. And I feel I need to say that the things that I've heard described as CSR today, fluffy things, charity projects, sponsorship, simply don't reflect the conversations that I'm having with people inside these businesses. I think a big issue here is the use of the term CSR. It has been around for a while. It's picked up a lot of baggage. And it's not just that it's the term itself is very confusing and used in different ways by different people. It's the fact that we're using a term at all. We should be having a conversation about business strategy, business responsibility, what a business does and how it does it. These are the conversations that we're having with professionals from inside these large organisations, and they are open to talk about it. I don't think we should position them as the enemy, because there is a direction forward, and it's about having a debate about relevant things. So let's not talk about charity projects on the side, even though they do good things. Let's talk about business strategy, if that's what the debate is.
I think we'll take one more comment.
It's probably an obvious question. My name is Romy Jenkins. I'm the project manager here for ethics, sustainability and engagement. So my question is, given the consensus among the panel, what is the end game if we do nothing? And I'd like to address that question particularly to Bobby and Claire.
Can I ask the panel just to have like two responses from 2 or 3 people? So maybe Bobby, Claire, and one other person.
I want a specific response to 2 questions, and I think yours is a little bit more complicated, so I think I'll let the panel also start. Your question about are we hypocrites? Of course we are. Yeah. You want to point to anybody in this room? I don't know where this came from. I try. You think Body Shop is a good company? Body Shop has got worse policies than Philip Morris has in terms of the cigarette manufacturer. So is this made from human rights violations? Yes, perhaps capitalism is a human rights violation. I don't know. So to answer your question, if you have to go by that, by purchasing power, the entire Western world would be naked and hungry. Okay, so let's move on from there. Your question, sir, about shareholder activism is something which I've also struggled with a fair bit. Unfortunately, the empirical evidence says the opposite. If you look at the height of sweatshop movement against, the anti-sweatshop movement against Nike, so there's a study done which looked at 8 years of anti-Nike protests and anti-Shell protests, which was a very visible protest. In each of those years, at the peak protest, Nike's share price was on a steep rise. Shell's share price was a steep rise. 5 days before the Enron scandal, before Enron became bankrupt, the CEO of Enron received an award of being the most socially responsible, the most admired company in America. So while there is a legal and perhaps a more concrete way of doing exactly what you said, through investors and shareholders, it is a very, very negligible force as far as the empirical evidence is concerned.
Claire?
Well, firstly, I've been challenged on my hypocrisy. All my clothes are second-hand. I don't buy things new because I don't want to be engaging in that market, and when I do, I buy them from co-ops where possible. And I think that it's partly about what we decide to do as individuals and what we buy, but I think it's about us acting together politically much more than it is about any of our lifestyle choices, so I think that's kind of irrelevant. On the point about the failure of NGOs and the failure of civil society, the Global Compact is kind of corporations putting forward what their ethics are, and it's for society to then challenge them. Well, I'd like to see the money to be out there to fund organisations like Corporate Watch, who report on the failings of business to live up to what they state their aims are. If all the corporations put their CSR budgets to one side, gave them all to an independent monitoring body that then fed them out to small organisations that were going to research actually what they were doing, I think that there might be a lot more information about what companies are actually doing. What we have is CSR, which is disinformation rather than information. And what's the end game if we do nothing? I don't think anyone's saying we do nothing. I'm not saying we do nothing. I'm saying that we don't expect corporations to regulate themselves. We don't expect voluntary initiatives to be the solution. I think the end game is political action. It is people coming together to try and decide what kind of world we want to create and what strategies we take forward. People, coming together in the street. We've seen with Occupy, people coming up with this concept of the 99%. And, you know, it's not a massively clearly articulated solution, but it's people starting to come together and actually organise politically together, and that for me is the way forward that I want to be involved in. And the companies can, you know, they can tinker around the edges if they want to.
Okay, so let's go back to the floor. More questions or comments? Yeah. At the back. At the back.
My name's Diana Leet, and I'm also a visiting professor here. I unfortunately arrived late, so I apologise if this was dealt with earlier. But one of the difficulties I had in addressing this question was that some years ago I did some work on voluntary organisations and accountability. And one of the clearest messages from that was that people mean completely different things when they talk about holding people to account or organisations to account. And listening to the panel, I felt that some people were using holding corporations to account as meaning requiring them to give an explanation of what they do, which is of course completely different from having the sanctions to require them to change what they do. And I suppose if I had to give a defence of CSR, which I have to say I've never particularly tried to do before, it would be that maybe what CSR has done over the last 20, 30 years is change the legitimacy of the asking of certain questions, so that 30 years ago, it was if you'd said to business, well, what's your effect on the environment, for example, they'd have probably told you to push off because it's not a relevant question, and you know, our business is to make profits, not to do charity or something or another. So I think maybe what corporate social responsibility has done is to change the legitimacy of the questions that one can ask, but has probably rather failed to do very much to change, to provide sanctions to change what businesses actually do.
Thank you. Yep. Yes.
Hi, my name's Heather Thomas, and I'm Development Director of a charity, actually, for youth services. And for about 12 years, I've worked on the other side of CSR and seen the benefits of it. The wool hasn't been pulled over my eyes. I'm not naive. I understand and agree with a lot of what's been said today. But I've heard people call sponsorship fluffy. I've heard somebody suggest that we should take all the money that's given to CSR and throw it to watchdogs to look after corporates. And I do feel that, and I know from experience, that the sponsorship money has actually had tremendous impact and created a hell of a lot of social value. And if we did away with CSR, where are those billions and billions of pounds going to come from? Because there is actually benefit being generated, even if in some ways, for some of the companies, it is a bit pastiche.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yep.
Carl Allen. 55 years ago, I was reading about what a corporation is. I'm older than I look. And I learned to read at a very, very young age. So I was reading what a corporation is in this encyclopedia, you know, and what's the role of corporations, and, you know, what good they can do and what bad they can do. So between 55 years ago and now, I've probably attended maybe 300 meetings or events or whatever on corporations and their responsibilities. So let's say this is 301. Mm-hmm. And if we think about Groundhog Day, do I need to continue?
Yeah.
If we think about Groundhog Day, this is 301 Groundhog Day. So how can we move beyond this?
Good question. Is there one more question from the floor? Yeah.
Bob Garrett. I'm visiting professor in corporate governance at Cass, and I chair the Centre for Corporate Governance in Africa at the University of Stellenbosch. But I spend most of my time in boardrooms, talking strategy and looking at the ways ahead. The question I was going to ask was just suggesting a possible way ahead, just one possible way ahead. But I've been looking, first of all, at that question, and hypocrisy kept coming up. I was thinking, does corporate social responsibility offer a meaningful opportunity to hold the National Health Service to account? Because at the moment we're wittingly killing hundreds of people. 5 more reports will come out. It will be thousands of people. And perhaps CSR could start a bit nearer home than to worry too much, even though I have an African hat on, and in fact have a Chinese hat as well. I think it's a really, really awkward question, and I'm very uncomfortable about that at the moment.
Okay.
Can I then say the other bit, which interested me, because I was in a meeting down in Canary Wharf where a whole lot of corporations were coming together to discuss this. And I'm afraid, and this is the terrible thing about business schools, I mean, the old saying, if you banned quadrants, business schools would completely collapse. Well, if we banned mnemonics, they would also collapse, and 2 more mnemonics came out. But the debate about them I found absolutely riveting. It was very simple. CSR is essentially dead in its present form. It's well past its sell-by date. The question then was, what comes in its place? The American brigade were pushing extremely hard for a thing they called CRG, which is compliance, risk, and governance. And they were really, really pushing for that. And when you had a look at that, that was because it was considered quite easy. Because if you kept a compliance focus on it, then you had numbers and you had boxes to tick and you could do all the rest. But the rest of the world in the room, and I'm happy to say they were in the majority, said no, it's much more difficult than that. The future is called ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance. And we don't have the measures on that at the moment. What we do have as a model is South Africa, post-King III, and the primary law that's come out of that. The way they have tackled this is to say, first of all, the company law and the corporate governance codes apply to every corporation in this country, public, private, or governmental. That is quite an interesting one. The second bit says, and it's all based on a notion of sustainability. And I personally think the ESG sustainability notion is where it's going to go. Thanks.
There was one more. Yeah.
Well, I don't need the microphone, so to make it faster. I'm Elisa Alt. I'm the Ruskin University in Cambridge Business School as well. So my question is more to Claire again. So basically, it seems to me that you don't believe in corporations, but that you do believe in people. So what would you then say to people who are working hard inside corporations to change them? Because you don't believe in the institution of a corporation, but you do believe in people. So that is the first part of the question. And the second is, you are assuming that everybody in society would care about holding corporations accountable. I care about that, you care about that. I believe the majority of people here care about that, but it breaks my heart when I see that many people actually don't care about that. So what would be the solution then? What is the role of corporations then?
Okay, so I think now I'm going to ask each member of the panel to respond very briefly, 1 point, if possible, because we're sort of running a little bit low on time. And then we'll ask the audience to vote. So we'll start at the end. Ronen.
Well, I'm not sure what to say. I think there were some very good points made by people here. I don't have anything more to add at this point.
Okay. Yeah.
I think I'm going to nick Ronan's point then, because I've got 2 things I wanted to respond to. Just to say, I thought your point, Diane, about is one of the pluses that CSR or the CSR period of debate has created a space for dialogue. And, I think I definitely agree with that. I think some of the more positive interactions that we've had through multi-stakeholder initiatives, I'd say, has been created by willingness of companies to talk and engage with people who they perhaps wouldn't normally have spoken to. But I think for me, the challenge is then moving beyond dialogue into action and change. And that's where I think we're stuck in a rut with CSR, and that's why I'm quite happy for us then to move on to another concept. I think if we're talking about moving beyond Groundhog Day, I think I'm more interested in talking about how the business strategy impacts on human rights and the environment rather than a CSR focus. And then just on the point about is it a failure of civil society to monitor the Global Compact, I think we're really stretched for resources. We have to pick and choose who we're going to be monitoring where, and quite frankly, the Global Compact really isn't a priority for us. So I think if we depend entirely on voluntary groups to do that monitoring, it's not going to work and it'll be really piecemeal. So that's where we'd see a better use of time, is getting the right regulatory framework in place.
Okay, just to come back about some of the points that have been made about CSR having achieved a change in the discourse, or being the product of a change in the discourse. It's actually people's movements and resistance movements, armed resistance movements in the Niger Delta, all over the world, consumer boycotts, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement is a response to the Palestinian civil society call by over 180 organizations in 2005 that has actually resulted in this UN report. This has all come about from massive pressure from below. That's why CSR exists. And to the point about fluffiness or not fluffiness, believe me, an art exhibition is fluffy compared to a militia that's guarding an oil rig, or your average company that is just screwing over workers in this country. You don't have to go to India, you don't have to go to Africa. There are people who are working in sweatshop conditions for below minimum wage. They have no community, they have no one to rely on. And if the lady there is asking who cares, they care, and they don't give a shit about corporate social responsibility because it means nothing to them. And it can't work for them. And, class is the elephant in the room here. I don't think there's really very many working class people in this room. And I think we'd have a very, very different debate if we were there, if they were there, and if we were talking about the people who actually don't have time to debate CSR because they're too busy being absolutely screwed by the companies that are claiming to be able to achieve it. So I'm sorry if I sound a bit angry, but I'm really angry. So yeah, and one final thing about, I found the question about, so what would we do without corporate, how would we have art in this country if corporations didn't sponsor it? That's just the most pitiful thing that I've heard. It's a failure of imagination. It's a failure of society that we have to rely upon corporations. What happens? We should have a much fairer taxation system, progressive taxation in this country, but also if we were paid more, if we had more money in our pockets, some of us would be able to be artists instead of funding being cut to art and it being a preserve of elites and the ruling class. So, there's massive issues there about how we're viewing corporations as somehow saving our culture. Nothing could be further from the truth. So yeah, people's movements are the answers, and they're happening, and it's already happening all around us.
I'd fully concur with that, and I just want to add, and I guess I better do so very, very quickly. Moving inside the corporation and moving inside, the circles of business people, and I've talked to a lot of business people about the issue of CSR, and there is concerns, and as anyone in this room, about the way things are going. It's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious on all of the indicators that you just mentioned before. The environment is the obvious one, global poverty, class, or whatever. Everyone's concerned about it, and going right into the corporate sector itself. I think the main problem, though, the way in which CSR is currently used, is that it plays into a very strong feel-good factor. And this is especially when it comes to CSR programs designed to recruit, motivate, retain employees within some of the more controversial sectors. I would go from the energy sector, tobacco companies, etc., who invest a huge amount of money in CSR, ironically enough, as millions of people die around the world from their products. So I think that the way in which CSR gets used at that level does play into a feel-good. It's almost like a therapy. It's almost a therapy. The world is in big trouble, and this really does help me kind of get on with business. It does really make me feel like an okay person at the end of the day, so I can sleep at night. And that's fair enough, but is a mechanism for actually changing the business as usual, which I think most of us would agree needs to happen. It's probably not the best way to go forward. And my more suspicious and more critical side would say that, especially when it's used in particularly controversial industries, but maybe even like the banking industry, CSR is more of an excuse for a culture of compliance, right? Rather than regulation, to ward off regulation, which is the big fear of most business corporations, that someone's going to step in and say, you need to follow the rules now. So I think CSR might be an excuse to kind of build this culture of, and you can see it in the newspapers every day, in the business section every day. It's all about a change of culture. We've got to change the people, and I don't think that's really going to happen. It's not necessarily a cultural issue, but a regulation issue. So they're my final thoughts, I guess.
I'd like to come back on your question. So I think that people are concerned. I think that maybe in this country we don't really feel that, because we live in a society where people are kind of cushioned a little bit from the harshest impacts of capitalism. But I think globally people are concerned, and we have to look at the majority of the world and see if we've got the power to actually create change and to create the social movements that can create change. And in terms of people working within corporations, I think that you need to think about where what you're doing leaves the balance of power between society and between corporations. And if you want to put your genius and your brain into something that beautiful, create alternative structures, ways of organising goods and services within society, so that we have a more humane, just, and socially equitable society. And the cooperative movement is one place where you can put that energy, and there are lots of other examples of ways of organising our economic lives without capitalism.
I started this mess, so I guess I can finish it. Just 2 points. I just want to make 2 points. Your point, sir, about Groundhog Day. You couldn't be more right. You talk about 301 Groundhog Days. You come with me, I will introduce you to communities who've been living Groundhog Day for 250 years. In South America, in Brazil, in Peru, in India, in Australia, in Canada. First at the receiving end of the British Empire through the East India Company, which is the world's first multinational corporation, then through nationalized steel mills, then to private steel mills, and now through NGOs. So for them, life has not changed in terms of dispossession, looting, and poverty, and death. There's an Aboriginal elder I worked with in Central Australia, and he was telling me, contemplating his life, about 80 years old. He says, I've been colonized, recolonized, empowered, post-colonized, disempowered, stakeholder engaged, CSR. My life has not changed in 40 years, but I have one hell of a vocabulary. Your point, sir, is the key point. You have hit the nail on the head. This is where, and I agree with you, I have a lot of contempt for, I've made a good living biting the hand that feeds me, okay? The last place a company will go for research is a business school. I completely agree with you. But you actually pointed out to the key issue. Issue is right now, it's so cutting edge that it's not been published yet. People are talking about it. There's some people in this room who are writing about it. Is the issue of governance. That is where the end game is. The end game is, it's not corporate governance. It's not about directors should not pay bribes or dividends. That's not the crap. It is the governance of corporations for society, which definitely means that there needs to be other groups involved in corporate decision making in there. That is basically where the end game is how do marginalized stakeholders who are at the receiving end of CSR, how do non-market shareholders, how does the tribe in the Amazon, how do non-state stakeholders, how do they ensure that their rights are protected in a democracy? through the notion of corporations. I also take your very valid point about NHS, and the way I use the word corporate sector, the state is included. For me, the Greenpeace is corporate sector, right? So everybody, the Red Cross is the corporate sector as well. So I'm using the word corporate not with a capital C, but with a small c. Does that make sense? Okay.
Okay, well, so controversy has ruled today. I thank the floor for many of its good responses. Some of you should have actually probably been on the panel with us, I think. Now, what you get to do now is have an opportunity to voice your opinion. So, yeah, thanks. So you get to use your clicker now and to vote. Does CSR offer a meaningful opportunity to hold corporations to account? Hopefully the floor's responses are more varied than the panel's.
A, if you think yes, and B, if you think...
That one, maybe.
That's
right. What's C for maybe?
There's one A or one B, either one. Yes, A is yes and B is no. One is yes and B is no. Any more? Just about to close the poll soon. Okay, so let's see. Whoops. So it's quite balanced, actually. So thanks for that. Now we have some. I'd just like to thank the panel once again. I'm glad to see we actually have a balanced approach, given the sort of one-sided panel to some extent. Thank you for all coming along. I think we had a fantastic debate. There's some drinks outside if you'd like to continue the debate outside. I'm sure all of the panelists would be